Thank you, Lavina, for that wonderful introduction. Very flattering. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see you. Today I'm not going to be talking about art history. This is a rather radical change for me. It's a different brand or style anyways. I'm going to be talking about a memoir that I'm just finishing up, and I'm looking at maybe having it come out in the summer. It's called Behind the Lines, A Dubious Apprenticeship in Maximum Security, talking about the 3 years that I spent as a very young man on the staff of a maximum security prison in Calgary. So a long way from art history, right? So I guess, Jason, we can start with the first slide. Excellent, yeah, that's fine. And I could just take it from there. Perfect. Excellent, thanks. All right, so the book itself starts with a disclaimer. The following contains scenes of extreme violence, obscene language, full frontal nudity, sexism, racism, blasphemy, smoking, drug and alcohol consumption, homophobia, firearms, impaired driving, bad judgment, country music, and murder. A lot of murder, unfortunately. 1982, it was Calgary or bust. Bailing on the bleak political economic climate of post-referendum Quebec, I joined thousands of other young Easterners on a hopeful migration to booming Alberta. Many ended up in jail. I ended up being the guy booking them in. At age 20, I was handed a rare opportunity. All access, free run of the notorious Calgary Remand Centre, the very hub of Southern Alberta's correctional system. And I'd be in the middle of everything. I was processing all incoming and outgoing inmates. I was dressing murderers for court. I was drinking with guards and cops. I was chatting with judges, and I was supervising work crews of dangerous sex offenders. It was fun. It was also an ideal training ground for an aspiring journalist. For reasons that I'll soon explain, this is literally my bucket list book, because for years I've been encouraged, cajoled, and just nagged by fellow journalists, especially my colleagues on the faculty of journalism at Concordia, to write this book. You know, this was a great experience, you really have to do this. But I kept putting it off, and I finally convinced myself that waiting 40 years would be a good buffer period for all parties concerned. And so I happily put off writing about the sights and sounds and smells of prison. Finally, I should mention that I'm really uneasy with the word memoir. You know, like, it just reeks of pretentiousness, right? Like, you know, my memoir, like, you know, like it should be pronounced in a hearty French accent, the compiled braggings of some vain celebrity. But that's not what this is. This is a work of creative nonfiction, and it took on elements of true crime reportage along the way. Then it begged for illustrations. But now, as I turn 65, my 40 years are up, and it's finally time to tell the story. So Behind the Lines, I composed it in 3 parts. The first is titled Here There Be Tigers. The second part, Exterminate All the Brutes. And the third part, which leads up to the big 1984 riot in which I was peripherally involved, The Tigers Break Free. That's sort of the arc of the book. The beginning, it starts, because when I arrived in Calgary, I arrived in a city of fear because there had been 2 brutal murders in southern Calgary. 2 girls had been abducted and raped and murdered, and the RCMP were involved in this really, really dramatic manhunt. So I landed in Calgary in January '82. It was a city of fear. And finally, when they did arrest these guys for the murders, I was reading about in the papers, and you know, there was a lot of rumors coming out of the city bucket about these guys, you know, but the one thing that I knew for sure, that I would be face to face with these 2 monsters soon enough. And so the first part of the book deals with these two murderers and their stay with us in the remand center. And when they were finally sent off to the pen, then it was the build-up to the sort of catalytic riot in 1984. So that's kind of like the narrative structure of the book. But first of all, I have, this is the proposed cover. That shows the jail in Calgary. And so a little bit of the, what I call the annoying but obligatory backstory. In 1981, I was the long-haired drummer of a tight little blues band in Montreal. I was 20 years old. And I was also floundering in my studies at Champlain College. And as you can see there, on the left, that's me as a young journalist, and on the right, the drummer in the band. And below there is my very first byline, Led Zeppelin, new album, new direction. So you can tell right away how old that is, because Led Zeppelin broke up in 1980. But the problem was, here I was in CEGEP, and I got addicted to working on the school paper, where I was the copy editor, and I wrote a popular rock music column. But I couldn't break into freelancing, because the Montreal Star had recently folded, and the city was just overflowing with very talented, seasoned professionals. So I just couldn't really break in. I didn't know anybody, and it was very difficult. I was just a kid, and the Gazette at that time, they didn't return calls for people they didn't know. And so as I wrote in the book, I had no time for that catch-22 bullshit. So it was a bleak time. John Lennon was dead, and Quebec was dying, sort of flushing itself down the economic toilet over politics and language issues. Post-referendum Quebec was a very bleak place, especially for business opportunities. Businesses were moving out, everything was moving to Toronto or farther west. Employment was scarce. So I was kind of at a crossroads. I didn't really know what I was going to do until my cousin Dave in Calgary, during our annual Christmas phone call, said, "Get your ass out here. We need guys like you. You're educated, you speak French." He was working in the correctional sector. He says, "Come on out, you're guaranteed a job. You can crash on my couch, no problem." So I said, "Oh, okay." I didn't know what else to do. So in January of '82, I claimed my place in music history as the Pete Best of the Paul Arthur Blues Band, settled what meager affairs I had, borrowed one-way airfare, and joined thousands of other Easterners on the hopeful migration to Alberta. Maybe this would be a gap year, maybe it would be my lost weekend, who knows? But I just needed the opportunity, I needed the experience. So 2 days after leaving Montreal, I was hands on the Bible sworn in and issued a photo ID attesting that I was an employee of the Solicitor General of Alberta and a peace officer pursuant to the Criminal Code of Canada. I had a little photo ID with a short-haired kid with a very stunned expression on my face, because it happened so quickly. In 1982, the Calgary Remand Centre was a maximum security behemoth rising 8 stories over 6th Avenue in downtown Calgary. It was dark and forbidden looking, sort of some architect's half-assed attempt at brutalism. The only clue that this was actually a prison was a corner of the exercise yard on the 6th floor, which you can sort of see at the very left there. It's not very clear there, and also across the street, there was always a gang of girls holding up signs and hearts, I love you, and all that for the boys gathered at the windows upstairs. The odd boob might pop out sometime, but there was always a bunch of girls there waving. And the only other clue that this was a correctional institution was, if you see it's a little dark on the side, the garage. There was a couple of times a day an RCMP van or the CRC's own Black Maria would nose out of the garage and turn up 6th Avenue. Now, once you got inside the building, for me, to get to where I worked. I felt like Don Adams in the beginning of Get Smart, walking down these corridors with this gate opening and the closing behind you, and then the next one opening. It took me about 5 minutes to get from visiting control to where I worked. I worked at the end of 2 big holding cells where you had to pass through about maybe 12 inmates just to get to where I worked, and the air was always filled with cigarette smoke and BO. It was pretty disgusting. And then there was a little sign next to our counter, and it said, "All persons admitted to this institution will be treated with delousing solution." Little did I know how involved I would be in that very quickly. My 2 co-workers here, this shows the counter. This is what inmates saw when they arrived, when they were being admitted. My 2 co-workers were a couple of snarly old soldiers named Arch and Bert. These guys were lifetime Canadian forces. They were retired, and now they were working in corrections. And they ran the stores operation where I was hired with military precision, with no room for error nor bullshit. And God help the inmate or guard who attempted any of the latter. These were 2 of the toughest guys I've ever met, and they were both in their 60s. Here we are. This is me with Arch and Bert in our little office. And on the far right there, you can see our supply of latex gloves, which is de rigueur equipment when you're in that job. The first thing Arch said to me was, "Thank Christ you can parlez-vous, because we get a shit ton of your crazy Quebec Frenchies out here. I can't speak French." The only French Arch ever picked up overseas was "Voulez-vous coucher avec mon oncle?" Okay, so, by comparison, in Quebec, my French was deemed shaky at best. Out there, I was Baudelaire, right? And we would call these the inmates to the counter to be processed, and Arch would just butcher these names. And I remember once, he says, "Okay, call the next guy on the list, Dennis Gauthier." So I called him, "Denis Gauthier." And I had a friend for life. He came in, "Oh, thank you, boss. Somebody finally said my name right." So, but, so I was considered bilingual out there, but it turned out my English was what needed work, especially the local vernacular. At one point, an inmate came to the counter and he mumbled something, "Gaunch." "What did you call me?" "Gaunch." I said, "What?" I said, "Sorry, boss, what?" I said, "What did you call me?" He said, "No, I was just asking to to score another pair of gaunch," pointing to his underpants, which were admittedly torn and frayed. So I said, "Oh, gaunch, okay." I said, "I'm from Montreal," So anyway, I became sort of an unofficial translator. A lot of Francophone inmates were having trouble with guard, and if the guard knew me, he would call me and say, "What's this guy saying?" or whatever. So I was somebody. I was contributing. It was great. What we did, our function in the stores department was to store the inmate street clothes while they were with us and issue the prison khakis, and also maintain the bedding and the inventory of towels and everything. So anything that they needed upstairs, we supplied when they came in. We dressed inmates for court when they'd come down. If they had a court date, they'd come down. We'd give them their suits or their street clothes, and they'd get changed, and they'd go to court and then come back and get changed again. This was a daily function that we did. So all the admitting and releasing came through us over the counter. And most of the CRC was not a serving institution. It was the central hub of the criminal justice system in southern Alberta. So our inmates were not serving sentences. They were there either on trial or awaiting bail, or they were in town for an appeal. But it was a maximum security prison, and we had everything from fraudsters to murderers, and at different levels on different floors and cell blocks. And every day we sent a shipment of of freshly sentenced inmates to the correctional center at Spy Hill, just outside town. And every afternoon, we received our bucket list, the list of inmates coming down from the city cells, the bucket. So that's why this book is, I call it literally my bucket list book, because you lived and breathed by that bucket list, because that told you how many people would be coming down. 5 was a light day, 25, 30 would be pretty heavy. So that was everything was determined by this bucket list. So everybody who was hired to work within face-to-face with murderous inmates was first required to meet with our Deputy Director of Operations Security. This guy, I love this guy. He was the one prison official that I had the most respect for. Everybody called him the Secret Squirrel, after the old cartoon character, because he was really into covert operations and tactics and everything, and he was always spying on someone. He was like a cliche CIA operative. So he was the squirrel. And I was summoned to his office to get the orientation spiel one day, soon after I was hired. Now, his office was festooned with crests and badges of other correctional centers and police forces and district attorneys that he traded with other law enforcement professionals at conventions across North America. They traded like cards, And so he had this huge collection of these colorful badges all over the office. Now, the squirrel knew. He had somehow found out, he'd done his homework, and he found out that I was a journalist, or a college journalist anyways. I'd been published a few times. And, I told him, yeah, I'd written a wildly popular rock music column in college, sure, And he said, well, you're not going to be doing that here. Just because it was very, very strict. You could not speak to the press. I could not write anything while I was an employee of the CRC. He didn't want to see my byline anywhere. He said, if I so much as covered a barn dance in Airdrie, I would have been terminated with extreme prejudice. He was very clear. So then, after that, he showed, the basic security things like key control and, stay away from the bars and certain places, because one of our cell blocks was like in Silence of the Lambs, with really, really dangerous people. You stayed away from those bars, you just knew. But so then he said, yeah, you just want to see how evil these inmates can be. He pulled out a box and he took out a collection of little shivs and shanks and other ugly little weapons that inmates had fashioned from everyday objects, which had been confiscated in raids upstairs. And he gave me this little pick with about 3 inches long, with a nice sort of molded toilet paper mache handle. And while I was looking at this, he said, yeah, these inmates, he says, be careful, they're evil. They have all the time in the world to sit and scheme about how they'll, bang, get you. The shock to my eardrums. He'd slammed something down on his filing cabinet, like a shotgun blast. Then he held it up. It was an inmate's sock containing a rock-hard ball of aluminum foil that an inmate had collected from all the cigarette packs. He said, one blow to the head would kill you. It weighed a pound. So I was all shaken from that. And so that was the end of the spiel. He put a hand on my shoulder and he said, welcome to the CRC. He says, no matter how long you stay, or if you're here for a bit, fine, But let me tell you right now, whatever job you have, whatever career you go into, everything else will be kindergarten by comparison. And he was right. I've never had a job where, you could get shanked at any time, So then he leads me out of the office, of course, and out to the outer office where all the secretaries are all looking, smiling, because they'd all been alerted to the presence of a newbie by hearing that thud from inside the office. He did this to everybody, So I considered myself initiated. So our daily routine was the bucket list the bucket gang that came through, and we'd have to take their clothes mark it down, run them through the showers, and that, Arch would take everything down. He'd give them their soap, and they go in the shower. And then when they came out, I was waiting on the other end with their bedding and a towel. But then came that really awkward jailhouse ritual whereby I had to order each inmate as he came out. I'd throw him a towel, tell him to stand still, and I had a squirt bottle, and I had to squirt his genitalia with the strongest anti-crab lice solution you can imagine, right? Because the bucket upstairs was just crawling, everybody knew. Some guys even asked for seconds. And Arch, being the comedian he was, he knew that these guys were worried about lice and things like that. So whenever an inmate was going out and he left his stuff, like his canteen items, his magazines and everything, Arch would go through all the filthy magazines and cut out any cartoon that dealt with lice, buggery, or crabs, and he would tape them against this inside the window where they came out of the shower. So these poor guys, when they came out of the shower, the first thing they saw were these cartoons of people with lice and crabs and prison shower jokes and everything. Arch was a little twisted that way. But and the thing is, it scared more inmates than it amused, I think. But we had a wonderful array of inmates that we dealt with. Some of them were quite memorable. One guy I remember, his name was Julius. He was from one of the nearby reserves. And he was not your typical indigenous inmate. He came down, he spoke like a game show host. Hey boss, how you doing? And he was only a small little guy, right? The thing with Julius was he'd only seen the CBC. That was the only media that he had on the reserve. So any concept of the outside world came from the CBC. So he would do impressions of Al Waxman and Bruno Gerussi, and one time he was upstairs in the dorm, and he almost caused a fight because he wanted to control the TV, and he couldn't understand why all the other inmates in the dorm didn't want to rock out to the Tommy Hunter show. So, but he was great. He was a lot of fun to have around. The only problem with Julius, he had no problem in jail, he had problems getting home. So we released him, and he was going to the bus station, he was getting the next bus to Gleason, he was on his way. So we shook his hand, oh, take it easy there, Julius. Yeah, no problem, boss, hey, catch you soon, And so finally, 2 days later, he's back in. Julius, what happened? Oh, I went to the bus station, it was an hour before my bus, so I went to the hotel, got a beer. Next thing you know, the cops, blah, 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 he's back in jail. Oh, poor Julius. Okay, so a couple of days later, he's back down for release. Arch says, okay, Julius, now go straight to the bus station, don't piss around. Okay, yeah, you bet it, boss. 2 days later, Julius is back in. What happened? He says, oh, this time I got as far as McLeod Trail, ran into some buddies from the reserve. Next thing you know, the cops are on us, back in. So the third time, we said, Julius, you got to, he said, don't worry, boss. He says, you got divine intervention. So he got Major McMillan, who was the prison chaplain of the Salvation Army, came down, and he personally escorted Julius out of the building, and he was going to take him right to the bus station, buy his ticket, and make sure he got on the bus. And so the last we saw of Julius, he was waving to us, giving us the peace sign, saying, time to roll on down the highway, boss. So, and that was it. But I never saw him again. But he really made an impression. He was one of those go-getting inmates. He knew that he was going to really make something of himself. I just never heard from him again, but I assume that he became very successful. And the squirrel, sometimes an inmate would come in and the squirrel would really put the extra security on him. We had one guy, he was from Tennessee. He was known as the Pinball King of Nashville. This guy, he was on the FBI's most wanted list. So of course the squirrel didn't want to screw up when we had him because he didn't want to look bad with all his buddies that he traded his badges and crests with in the States. So once the FBI confirmed that this was the guy they were looking for, He was locked up. He didn't go anywhere without belly chains and ankle shackles. And he had 3 names. We had him down as Donald Jackson, but in the States they knew him as Tim Collins, and in Calgary he was using the name Fraser. So Arch, of course, called him the Sybil of the South. And you can see at the bottom left, these are all from the Tennessee newspaper, all the different photos of the guy, all these different personalities. But he was, despite this sort of really dangerous aura around him, he was the sweetest Southern gentleman. Now, he was up for a litany of charges in the States, like he was going to be doing 12 years once he finished in Calgary. But he said, whenever he was at our counter, he was so nice, he was really sweet, and he was just, he spoke, his voice was like a cross between Foghorn Leghorn and Joseph Cotton in Citizen Kane. He kind of spoke like that, and he was just the nicest man. And then one day he was going down a court, and we were changing him into his suit, and he had these legal books with him. And so I looked, I said, geez, and he had the sheets of paper fell out, and they're just like filled with tight handwriting. And I said, Jesus, Jackson, like, you've really been busy. And he looked at me and said, son, he always called me son. He said, son, I have been busier than a Parisian hua on Bastille Day. He was great. He finally, we sent him off to the pen, and we didn't see him again. But I think after he'd done his 6 years in Calgary, he was sent back to Tennessee to serve the rest of his 12 years that he'd escaped from before he came to Calgary. So Friday nights were big for me. Most people my age were going out to the clubs and all that. Not me. I was in charge of the weekly laundry and the clothing change. So Friday nights, we'd send up all new clothes to the different floors, and they would get changed, and a guard and an inmate would come from each floor, would come down with laundry buckets filled with laundry. And so all the inmates were locked up in their dorms and their cell blocks. And then my work crew came down. It was usually 5 or 6 guys from Dorm 1. Dorm 1 housed the Skinners. So the Skinners were my work crew. Now, jailhouse slang, Skinners comes from a skin beef, which means they were all sex offenders in protective custody. These were the rapists and child molesters and other perverts. The predators on the outside were hunted in jail. So they were all lumped together in Dorm 1 in protective custody. And they were kind of the freaks, you know. They looked out for each other. They knew why they were in there. And they were just really, you know, if you offended one of them, you offended all of them. So I'm locked in with these 4 or 5 guys, and you know, I got the clipboard and they're counting stuff, and I'm supervising them. But I knew that if they decided to turn on me, a Todd Browning-inspired demise was all but assured. So you had to be careful, although they were usually on their best behavior because they were glad to come down and just to get a change of scenery on Friday night, because all the other inmates were safely locked up. So these guys could come down, and they got coffee and everything after. Sometimes part of my Friday night duties also was to book in the weekenders, these guys that, they were just normal guys who had jobs and that. They were doing short sentences, and they were allowed to serve them on weekends. So they'd come in on Friday night and get released on Monday, which was kind of a sweet deal, because the few hours they spent on Friday counted as a full day, and Monday morning release, that counted. Monday they were there too. So it was actually, they served 4 days of their sentence on the weekend. So they came down, they were there, and quite often I'd put them to work too with the Skinners. They didn't know what the other guys were in for, right? In fact, actually, once when they went back upstairs, the Skinners, a couple of weekenders were still there. And the guy turned to me and says, "Oh, those were nice guys I was working with. What are they in for?" I said, "Well, the fat one's in on rape charges, and the other one exposes himself in schoolyards." Oh God! So yeah, that was my Friday night. And also in jail, there There was always, you see guys in jail, they're all covered in tattoos, right? Some of them are nice, some of them not so nice. But every jail had at least one inmate who was good at making tattoos. And so you'd see some guys with fresh tattoos on their arm that they just got. It was against the rules, of course, because it altered their appearance and the description in their file. But they did it anyway. And one guy came down, and he was upset. But he was being released. I mean, most guys getting released were happy. You know, in fact, one guy I remember came down to get released. He did a little striptease, getting out of his inmate suit, and he was getting out. He was happy. But this guy Bruce was really angry. And so Art said, "What's wrong with you?" He said, "Oh, I just got a tattoo." "Yeah? Well," he says, "look at this." "Gee, Bruce." So he was understandably upset. The time that was his souvenir from jail, was a misspelled tattoo. But it was beautiful work, though, it was very well done. Unfortunately, he didn't pay attention when the guy was putting it on his arm. But some inmates were really talented, because in their canteen they could order, they could get colored pencils. And a few guys, they took that up and they made some drawings. One guy that we sent to Drumheller had beautiful, beautiful drawings. There was like a lion. It was life, like every hair, and a motorcycle, but you could see like the sun reflecting off the chrome. Just like photorealism with colored pencils. And I remember we were very careful, like packing his stuff when he went to Drumheller, to make sure that like his drawings were safe, because they were really amazing. So a little while later, another inmate went out, and he had colored pencils, but he was getting out or something, and like, okay, well, you just left them. So, free colored pencils. So I started drawing cartoons, like caricatures of our coworkers, which Arch loved, and he put them up on the wall. So here's our office wall with a few of my cartoons. These are when I first started, but as they became more and more popular, wall space in our office became scarce, because the more and more cartoons, every time I finished one, Arch would grab it and tape it up. So I was at least getting a little bit of artistic training while I was in there as well. And so, yeah, like I was, sometimes the guards would come in and look at the cartoons and everything. "Oh, do one of the guy in main control, do one of this guy." So I was getting orders from people to draw cartoons of all the guards in the place. The guards were a lot of fun. They were mostly, decent guys, and I got on really well with them. The practical jokes were popular. They really gave the RCMP a hard time when the RCMP would come in escorting prisoners. Sometimes they'd come in the garage, the RCMP, and they couldn't get out because our van was blocking the way, and geez, nobody could find the keys, or just little jokes, and there was like this rivalry going on with the RCMP officers and our guards. So that was one part of it. And I was painting too, and around this time I bought a little 1974 Pinto with a couple of bullet holes in the driver's side, as you can see there. I got it for like $300 from some guy who got it at a police auction. Some friend, after I signed the papers, he told me that this model had been recalled, the Pinto recall of the early 70s for the exploding gas tank. Luckily, I'm still alive. But it was a great mobile studio for me, because you see there's the hatchback, and I could fit my canvases in there, and I could drive out and I could paint around Calgary. So one day, I had this ne'er-do-well friend who lived next door. He got in trouble in Banff for impaired driving, and they confiscated his driver's license. So the following weekend, he said, "Look, can you give me a ride out to Banff? I got to get my driver's license." And he was meeting some friends who were camped out there or something. So, okay, fine. So I took advantage. Well, I'll put some canvases in the back of my car, and I'll take advantage. I always want to paint in Banff. So off I went. So we drove out about an hour out of the city, straight highway, and I didn't have a tape deck in my car, but I had this big portable stereo, and we had like Deep Purple, Made in Japan, blasting on the back seat as we're driving out there. So I dropped him off at the RCMP detachment and had the rest of the evening free. So I drove around looking for places to paint, and I found a place where there were these cliffs, as you can see on the right there. And so I set up my canvas, and there were a few people picnicking off to the side, but I was ignoring them. So I started to paint, and then all of a sudden, poof, it all disappeared in front of me. My easel and my big canvas both got swept away in the wind and over this ravine. And I wasn't about to go down there. It was gone, right? And it was a rookie mistake, but undaunted, I still had another canvas. So I took that, I propped that up against the side of the car, and I sat down, and then I started on this painting. So once I was almost finished, it was getting really dark. So I slid it into the back of the car, and I drove off, like looking towards the town of Banff. And as I turned a corner, suddenly, my headlights, there's this big elk standing in the middle of the road. I thought, oh, okay, and I couldn't drive either. It was like right there, and it was kind of like looking at me, And I remember I have this vivid memory of the flies circling in the light around this beautiful animal. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to honk my horn in case it would be mistaken for like some weird mating call, Can you imagine my obituary? So finally, it did move off a little bit, so I went around. But as I straightened out, flashing lights ahead of me. It was RCMP waiting, just sitting by the side of the road. They saw my erratic, they didn't see the elk, but they saw my erratic headlights. So I get pulled over. I think, okay, well, maybe I know this guy because the RCMP, they escorted prisoners back and forth from Banff Court every day, or every week anyway. So I knew a few of them. So this guy, I didn't recognize him, but when I passed him my license, I also passed him my prison ID. So he looks at me and asked where I worked. I told him. He says, okay. He says, he gives me a breathalyzer. I said, no, I haven't been drinking. I was fine. But that's turpentine you smell. It's not booze, He said, oh, yeah, sure. So I blow. Oh, okay, get out of the car, get into the, what? So he basically arrests me. I'm back of the RCMP car, and he drives me into town, to the Banff detachment. And if anybody knows me, I'm freaking out, my car was unlocked, my stereo's on the back seat, my deep purple tape, my canvas, it was all open. I thought, well, hopefully there are no criminals in Banff. Then I realized, why do I even know these guys? So they take me to the Banff detachment, and I'm sitting on a bench for about half an hour, and they're looking at me. The other cop looks at me. They make me blow another breathalyzer. Finally, after half an hour, they say, okay, the guy said, I'll drive you back to your car. And on the way back to the car, he told me why I'd been arrested. Wrong place, wrong time. I was collateral damage in that ongoing feud between our guards and the RCMP, because all the jokes and the hijinks took place on our turf at the jail. They finally had one of us on their turf. So they screwed around with me for a little, but it was fine. I mean, they're great guys, we were laughing about it, and they had great coffee, so I have no grudge against the RCMP. They were having fun, and I was collateral damage. Now, in every institution, there's at least one guard who can be bought, right? One guard who can be counted on to bring in some drugs or contraband to the inmates. Yeah, the CRC, this was Frank. Frank was a great guy, really friendly. I got on really well with him. And he was set up by some inmates. He was going to bring in some coke, but it turned out that it was a sting operation with the cops and the squirrel and everybody. So he got caught. And I was in the lunchroom with him at lunchtime. The few of us around the table, and the squirrel shows up in the doorway, and he says, Frank, can I see you a minute? So Frank gets up and he goes over, and we're all watching, and Frank, he still had the fork in his hand, and the squirrel just takes the fork out of his hand, and the cop turns him and cuffs him right in front of all the guards in the lunchroom. What happened was Frank had been asked by an inmate to bring in some coke. And he did. He went and he met the inmate's accomplice. He was given $300 or whatever and given the package to bring in, which he did. But it wasn't Coke. It was like baking soda or something. But Frank did not know that. He thought it was Coke. And so he was arrested and he went to trial. And but the judge had to throw out the charges because he didn't actually, there were no narcotics involved, right? And the judge was really mad. He says, only on a technicality does this man get off. But of course, Frank was discharged. The union didn't want to get involved, obviously, because dirty guards, they kind of shy away from that. And it just gave everyone a bad name. So that was the end of Frank. But he was a really nice guy, but you knew why, because all his shifts went well, because he was on the best of terms with all the inmates, because they knew he was the guy that could get them something. So yeah, in every institution there's guys like that, and for us it was Frank. The funniest guys we ever had were three guys, three average suburban guys who decided to kidnap a local wealthy philanthropist named Bellsberg. So these guys, they concocted this plan and they carried it out. He was abducted in front of his store, and they took him back to this suburban house and they tied him up and they threw him in the basement. And somebody said that they attached a bomb to him or something, you know, but I don't think these guys were too stupid to actually put a bomb together. They would definitely have been hoisted by their own petard, right? So they were charged, and they would be coming down. And once the story hit the newspapers about these kidnapped bunglers, in court they pleaded stupidity. They didn't plead innocence. And their lawyers were in court saying, no, our clients are dumb. Like, these guys are really stupid. In fact, his own lawyer compared them to the Marx Brothers, which I didn't agree with, because they were the guards were calling them the Three Stooges. And yeah, because one of them could have passed for Chico, you know, and the other one had some Groucho-like wit. But two of them resembled Shemp and Mo Howard, and the other guy, he looked just like Larry Fine, but without the curly hair. So they were definitely the Stooges, right? There was a bit of argument in the lunchroom one day. A bunch of guards were saying, Marx Brothers, Stooges, Marx Brothers. And the woman behind the lunch counter says, I can't believe I'm hearing this conversation. Grown men arguing about Stooges and Marx Brothers. But yeah, these three guys, they came down, and they decided that when they contacted the victim's family, they thought it'd be a good idea to identify themselves as a cell of international terrorists. In fact, it was just three local schmucks over on Cedarbrook Avenue, right? And so they actually tried to have the family wire money to a Swiss bank account for the ransom. And they asked for some enormous, several $1 million, and the family could only raise, 1.5 million Canadian, and so they were haggling apparently, and they haggled so long that it gave the police plenty of time to tap the guy's phone line. He called from home, right? Not brilliant guys, and so Arch just let them have it when they came down. He says, "You guys, of course, they got 12 years." Two of them, and one guy got 8 years or something. And Art said, but of course you got that. You're idiots. And they're yeah, well, your own lawyers are saying that you're idiots. So, and I remember when they went off, when they came back from getting sentenced, they were really upset. And one of them comes up to me and he says, he said, do you think I could get a blanket? I freeze my tuchus up there. It's really, it's cold. I said, I can't give you a blanket. You put in a request. I'll give you a blanket. But I couldn't unofficially give him a blanket, because if he was caught with an extra blanket, Bert would have gotten in a lot of trouble. So I said, no. And his little buddy says, Jim, this fucking blanket. And they started oh, we'll kill you. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I call main control, get these guys out of here. I was going to give the guy a blanket. I was going to call the duty officer on his behalf, say, can I give the guy a blanket? But since they threatened to kill me, no, goodbye. And so like 3 big guards came and dragged them up, and they're crying their eyes out. Like, I felt bad, like doing this to them on the worst possible day of their lives. But like, don't be rude and don't threaten me with death, you know? Like, so, so yeah, that was these. And at the beginning, you remember I talked about these 2 guys who had murdered a couple of women, and they were the subject of this huge manhunt when I arrived in Calgary in January of '82. Well, they were with us for over a year, going back and forth to court. It was James Peters and Robert Brown. Robert Brown was, to me, the devil. You know, like, I remember standing in front of this guy and looking at him and thinking, like, wow. Like, I felt like Max von Sydow in The Exorcist. I was like, you know, like, this is not some screenwriter's fantasy or some priest's Sunday sermon. This guy was the real devil. Like, this was the personification of evil. And he just looked at me, and I looked back at him, and that's who he was. He was just a stone-cold killer, and that's how he carried himself. And he would just go to court because they knew they'd confessed to the RCMP and everything. So their year-long trial was basically a sham. It was just a formality. And so Brown didn't even bother getting dressed sometime, but one time he came down and his shirt was all wet, his inmate shirt, and he says, "Can I get another shirt?" So yeah, so I grabbed we had like a Salvation Army bin that Major McMillan supplied us with some street clothes to give to inmates in an emergency if they needed to go to court. So I grabbed the black t-shirt and I tossed it to this guy Brown. He puts it on, and I don't know if you can see it there. It was a decal of Farrah Fawcett on his shirt, on this shirt. And I said, "Oh God, no, you can't wear that." And yeah, I'll wear it. And like, the guards are saying, "No, man, you can't wear that. Fuck you, I'll wear it." So off he goes to face on trial for killing 2 women with Farrah Fawcett on his t-shirt. Needless to say, when he came back that afternoon, he was not wearing that t-shirt. Yeah, they were with us for a long time, and they were, again, the Squirrel took extra precaution with them, always the belly chains and the ankle shackles, and they both got life, and they were sent off, and Brown, within I think 2 years of he was in jail in Ontario, he committed suicide. And Peters, I believe, is still alive. He's serving time in Nova Scotia. And one of the victims' mothers is now like she was lobbying to keep this guy off the street because his parole was coming up, and they took a lot of care to make sure that he remained incarcerated. Good thing too, because these guys were both like homicidal maniacs. But some guys were a little better to deal with. One guy named McCaffrey, he was an intellectual. And he came down, he was charged with stabbing an ex-girlfriend, but his defense was that he'd been hallucinating on acid and he thought he was Hamlet. And when he came down, he noticed there was some library books behind me that I'd confiscated from an outgoing inmate, and one of them was James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake. Now, and he looked at it and he says, "My God," he says, "there does seem to be a ray of sunlight in this dungeon after all." And so we start talking about James Joyce, and we start talking about Ulysses, and he starts, "Oh, yes, Ulysses, oh, Molly Bloom, yes, yes," and he starts doing Molly Bloom impressions. So he was this really a real sort of literary intellectual guy, but that became his defense in court. He went to court every day with his notes, and his defense was that he thought he was Hamlet. So he's reciting lines from the play in court. And at one point, it comes down in the morning, and he asked me to help run lines with him. So here I am, like with the Shakespeare in front of me, and coaching this guy who's on trial for stabbing a woman, and getting him to get his lines in court. And the court reporters of the Calgary Sun and Herald, they both had a field day with this, because. And they were quoting long passages of his soliloquies that he recited in court. But finally, the judge, actually, who was admitted a Shakespeare aficionado, was very lenient with him, and he gave him 12 years but he didn't give him life because he said, well, like, you don't seem to be a threat to society. He just had a personality disorder, so with the right treatment, he could have once again become a productive member of society. But I don't know, I never saw him again, but he was one of the most memorable inmates that we ever had. And we had, now, this is a shot of Bert. This is my boss, and he is like totally drunk. This was Stampede morning of the Stampede parade. Would come by would pass right in front of our building, and every year Bert, as a Shriner, would march with his fellow Shriners in the parade. But he would get dressed in our office and then parade right through the cell blocks and the holding cells in front of all these inmates, decked out in his Shriner outfit. And but one thing that happened at the Stampede was never reported in the media, and I think today if the media ever got a hold of it, they'd have a field day with it, because a few days before the opening day of Stampede, the city police would descend on downtown Calgary and pick up every Indigenous guy that they could find and put them in the paddy wagon, and they brought them downtown, and they would be charged with loitering or some minor offense, remanded in custody, and sent to us. So always preceding the Stampede, our holding cell would be filled with these Indigenous guys from the local reserves. Now, of course, like, this is so overtly racist, it's a terrible thing, right? Yes, but in our holding cell, it was like a celebration. It was happy. These guys were like kids at summer camp. They actually came to Calgary, some of them, just to get picked up, just to spend a couple of weeks in the jail, where they would have 3 square meals a day, they could watch TV, and they could catch up with all their friends. So it was like an annual thing for them. And then when the Stampede came by, the parade, they could all watch from the windows upstairs. So it was like win-win for these guys. And Arch loved them. He loved making them laugh. And we never, in the 3 years I worked there, I never once had a problem with any Indigenous inmate. They were just nice guys and just well-mannered, well-behaved, and mild-tempered. There were some problems upstairs, of course, as there are anywhere else. But in my experience and down where we worked, we never had problems with Indigenous inmates. In fact, Arch kind of went out of his way to make them laugh and to make them feel comfortable. But there were some, sad parts too. Bert remembered that a couple of years earlier, one of these Indigenous guys that was swept up in the pre-Stampede sweep was in the shower and taking a long time, and Bert said, "What's taking this guy?" And then he noticed there was water was flowing into the drain in front of it. So he went to investigate, and this old elderly guy was in the shower, and the shower was clogged. And so Bert looked, but it was moving. And it was all maggots in the shower that had been popping out of the guy's leg. So, of course, Bert called main control, and they called in emergency, and the guy was rushed to hospital, and he was told that he'd actually saved the guy's life, his quick thinking, And so Bert was just, and they wonder why I drink, like the things that you'd see in there. But one thing about Bert, his drinking was great because he would go out in the afternoon and to the bar, and sometimes, and on my birthday, I think my 22nd birthday, he took me with him. And we went to the St. Louis Hotel, which was just over the LRT tracks and just down from City Hall. And as we walked in, he said, "Oh, look, there's Ralph Klein." So Ralph Klein at the time was the mayor of Calgary. And when he wasn't in his office, he was holding court at this big table in the St. Louis Hotel, surrounded by cronies and just different people, like blue-collar guys in suits. And so as we were leaving, Klein looked over and says, "Hey, take it easy, fellas." So a couple of weeks later, I was downtown just after lunch, and I was walking by the St. Louis Hotel. "Oh, I'll go in, And they had good lunch specials, so I went in, and sure enough, there was Ralph Klein again with a few people, and he looked up and he kind of smiled at me. So I didn't know what to say. So I went into my best on the spur of the moment, like Ed Norton, Art Carney, hey, Ralphie boy. And he looks at me and says, yeah, like I've never heard that one before. But he smiled, and with his foot, he pushed the chair opposite him, like as an invitation for me to sit down. So I sat down, and I had a beer, and I spent about half an hour with Ralph Klein and his crony. I never got a word in edgewise. Like I shook hands with a few people and repeated my name a couple of times, but that was it, you know. But he didn't know how close he'd come to one of these Eastern creeps that had invaded Calgary for... Okay, so... Yeah, what happened was towards the end of, at the beginning of 1984, we were overcrowded, and there was a huge riot in the place. We knew it was coming, and in the book I go into great detail about the circumstances leading up to the riot. And when it finally happened on a Saturday night, early Sunday morning, I got a call from Bert, better get into work right away, there was a riot. So I had to go in with Bert, and we had to change 100 inmates because they were just covered with the tear gas, right? And so as we did that, it was just like all afternoon changing these guys and just choking with tear gas. So finally around 6 o'clock, I needed a break. So I went out and I went up and as I went outside, the press were there and a bunch of women yelling out names of inmates, like to know if they were safe or whatever. So I told the press, sorry guys, I can't, the squirrel would have killed me if I talked to the press, right? So I went up the street, had a sandwich and a couple of Cokes and came back. And as I was going back in the building, the same two guys were there with their photographer and everything. And they said, okay, can't you tell us anything about the riot, please? And I said, well, and nobody had died or anything. So I said, well, it could be worse. And that's all I gave them when I went in. The next day, the Calgary Sun comes out, and they quoted an employee who was working with the cleanup, said it couldn't be worse. So the exact opposite of what I told the guy. And that was the moment where I said, you know what? I could do better than that. I could be a much better journalist. Here I am, like squirting bikers' genitals and doing things. I could be actually a journalist. I'm better than him. And that was the tipping point where I said, okay. So that was April of 84. And so for the rest of the spring and summer, I decided I'm going to move back to Montreal. I started applying at Concordia. And that summer, I settled my affairs in Calgary. I quit and I moved back to Montreal to start studying. And it was Labor Day weekend of 84. The Pope and I both arrived in Montreal on the same weekend. And some nut, he marked the occasion by bombing the Central Station. I was home. And so that's my story. So, of course, I go into much greater detail in the book, a lot more incidents, a lot more inmates and anecdotes and things like that. But that was the experience of my 3 years working in maximum security, my dubious apprenticeship, and the spark that got me writing again. Thanks.